Some heroes deliver more than mail. When 58-year-old Robert Thompson walked onto the Tonight Show stage with the unhurried pace of someone who had covered the same neighborhood streets for 3 decades, nobody expected him to reveal the most inspiring education story in television history. Jimmy Fallon had planned a simple segment about postal heroes. Zendaya was there to promote her latest film, but what Robert was about to confess would silence Studio 6B and prove that sometimes the most powerful classrooms have no walls, no desks, just a mailman's bag and the courage to help others learn. The cameras were rolling, the audience was smiling at the dedicated postal worker, and then Robert spoke 11 words that changed everything. I've been teaching people to read on their doorsteps. What came next wasn't just television, it was a masterclass in quiet dignity that would leave two celebrities speechless and redefine what it means to serve others when literacy becomes a lifeline. Robert Thompson had been delivering mail in the Riverside neighborhood of Detroit for exactly 30 years, 7 months, and 14 days. He could tell you the precise count because he had started the job fresh out of high school when the Postal Service still offered steady careers with good benefits and the promise of serving your community for an entire lifetime. What was supposed to be a reliable job with a pension had become his life's mission, but more than that, it had become his classroom without walls, teaching fundamental skills to adults who had been failed by traditional education systems. The Riverside neighborhood was a working-class area that had been hit hard by Detroit's economic struggles over the past several decades. Many of the residents worked multiple jobs in factories, cleaning services, and restaurants, honest work that paid the bills, but often required long hours that left little time for education or self-improvement. The neighborhood was home to immigrants from various countries, elderly residents who had grown up in an era when formal education wasn't accessible to everyone, and adults who had dropped out of school to work and support their families. During his first year on the route, Robert had approached mail delivery with straightforward professionalism: sort the mail, walk the route, place letters and packages in mailboxes, move on to the next address. But gradually, he began to notice patterns among his customers that concerned him. People would avoid eye contact when he handed them certified letters requiring signatures. Others would ask him to just tell me what it says when he delivered official documents. Some residents would simply let mail pile up rather than dealing with correspondence they couldn't read. Delivering mail in a neighborhood where a lot of people struggle with literacy is different from other routes, Robert later explained to new postal workers he trained. You realize that for some people, getting mail isn't convenient. It's terrifying. When you can't read, every piece of mail could be something important that you're missing, something urgent that you can't understand. The teaching had begun almost by accident. During Robert's second year on the route, Mrs. Maria Santos, a middle-aged woman who worked as a house cleaner and lived alone in a small apartment, had been receiving increasingly urgent notices from her utility company. When Robert handed her the third, final notice envelope, he saw tears forming in her eyes as she stared at the words she couldn't decode. "I don't know what this says," Mrs. Santos had whispered in heavily accented English, "but I think it's bad." Robert had looked at this woman who was clearly intelligent and hardworking, but who had been denied the educational opportunities that most people took for granted, and he had made a decision that would define the next 28 years of his career. "Would you like me to read it to you?" Robert had asked gently. The relief on Mrs. Santos's face had been immediate and profound. The letter was indeed a final notice before electricity shut off, but because Robert had read it to her, she was able to understand the urgency and make payment arrangements before losing power. But more importantly, that interaction had opened a conversation about Mrs. Santos's struggle with reading English, her embarrassment about asking for help, and her desire to learn. "I came to this country 20 years ago," Mrs. Santos had explained. "I worked so hard, but I never had time to learn to read English good. My children help sometimes, but they are busy with their own families. I feel so ashamed when people give me papers and I don't know what they say." That afternoon, Robert had spent an extra hour on Mrs. Santos's porch, not just reading her mail, but explaining what each piece meant, helping her understand the difference between bills and advertisements, teaching her to recognize important words and phrases that appeared regularly in her correspondence. From that day forward, Mrs. Santos began waiting for Robert's daily visits, not just to receive her mail, but to continue learning. Robert started bringing examples of common forms and documents, teaching Mrs. Santos to recognize key words, helping her practice writing her name and address, gradually building her confidence with written English. Reading isn't just about books. Robert later explained to colleagues who wondered about his extended delivery times. For adults who can't read, every piece of mail is a mystery that could contain something life-changing. Teaching someone to read their own mail is teaching them to take control of their own life. Word about Robert's informal literacy lessons spread quietly through the neighborhood. Other residents who struggled with reading began asking for similar help, and Robert discovered that the need was far greater than he had initially realized. Adults who had dropped out of school, immigrants who spoke English but couldn't read it well, elderly residents whose vision had declined, all of them had been managing their lives without fully understanding the written communication that surrounded them daily. Robert's teaching method was practical and dignified. He would arrive at each house during his regular delivery time, read mail aloud when requested, and use real documents as teaching tools. He helped people understand their utility bills, medical correspondence, legal notices, and government communications. But more than that, he taught basic reading skills using the materials that were most relevant to their daily lives. I used their actual mail as textbooks, Robert explained. Instead of abstract reading exercises, we worked with their real bills, their real letters, their real problems. When someone learns to read their own electric bill, they're not just learning vocabulary, they're learning to manage their household, to understand their expenses, to take control of their life. The lessons took place on porches, in doorways, at kitchen tables, wherever people felt comfortable learning. Robert never charged for his services, never made appointments, never created formal curricula. Instead, he simply extended his daily mail delivery to include patient, respectful instruction for anyone who wanted to learn. Over the years, Robert's informal literacy program had helped dozens of adults develop reading skills that transformed their lives. People who had been dependent on others to interpret important documents became self-sufficient. Immigrants who had been limited to jobs that didn't require reading were able to pursue better opportunities. Parents who had been unable to help their children with homework became active participants in their education. Mr. Robert taught my mama to read when she was 55 years old, said Jennifer Martinez, whose mother had been one of Robert's students. Mama had been cleaning houses her whole life because she thought that was all she could do. After she learned to read, she got her GED, then became a certified nursing assistant. She worked in a hospital for 15 years before she retired, all because a mailman took time to teach her. Robert kept informal records of his students' progress, not in any official capacity, but because he wanted to celebrate their achievements and ensure he was providing appropriate help for each person's skill level. His records included notes like, Mrs. Chen can now read utility bills independently, working on medical forms, or Mr. Rodriguez completed GED after 3 years of mealtime lessons, now helps his grandchildren with homework. The emotional rewards of Robert's teaching were enormous, but the time commitment was significant. What should have been a 6-hour mail route often extended to 8 or 9 hours as Robert provided reading instruction to students along his route. He used his lunch breaks and personal time to prepare materials, often photocopying examples of common forms and documents that his students could practice with at home. People ask me why I don't just refer people to adult education programs, Robert said, but those programs often have waiting lists, require transportation, meet at times when working people can't attend. My students work 2 or 3 jobs, take care of families, don't have cars. Learning on their doorstep during mail delivery is sometimes the only education option that fits their lives. Robert's colleagues at the Detroit Post Office had initially been puzzled by his extended delivery times and deep involvement with customers. Most mail carriers maintained professional distance, focusing on efficiency and speed rather than personal relationships. But as word spread about Robert's literacy work and its impact on the community, his approach began to be recognized as an innovative model for community service. Robert has redefined what it means to be a postal worker, said Patricia Williams, the Detroit post office supervisor. He's not just delivering mail, he's delivering opportunity, dignity, and empowerment. We've started encouraging other carriers to be aware of literacy needs in their communities. The impact of Robert's teaching extended beyond individual students to entire families and the broader community. Children whose parents learned to read were more likely to value education and perform better in school. Families became more financially stable as parents learned to understand and manage their bills, taxes, and legal documents. The neighborhood as a whole became more informed and engaged as residents gained the literacy skills needed to participate fully in civic life. Literacy is about more than just reading words, Robert explained. It's about understanding your rights, managing your responsibilities, participating in your community. When adults learn to read, their whole families benefit. Their children see education as valuable, their households become more stable, their communities become stronger. Robert's work had remained largely invisible to the outside world until a local story about adult literacy rates in Detroit caught the attention of a community journalist. The reporter had been interviewing residents about barriers to education when multiple people mentioned their mail carrier, Robert, who had taught them to read right on their front porch and changed their whole life by helping them understand their mail. Curious about this unusually dedicated postal worker, the journalist had reached out to the Detroit Post Office and discovered the extent of Robert's informal education program. The story that resulted highlighted Robert's 3 decades of doorstep teaching and the transformation it had brought to dozens of families, catching the attention of national media outlets and eventually the Tonight Show's producers. When Tonight Show producers reached out to Robert about appearing on the show, he was hesitant and confused. He had never sought recognition for his teaching and was uncomfortable with the idea of being celebrated for what he considered simply part of doing his job well. But the producers convinced him that sharing his story might inspire other communities to address adult literacy needs, and Robert agreed to participate if it might help other struggling readers receive support. The taping was scheduled for a Wednesday evening in January. Robert had never flown on an airplane, had never been to New York, and had never taken time off work for anything other than family emergencies. The entire experience was surreal and overwhelming, but he kept reminding himself that he was representing not just himself, but all the adults who had been denied educational opportunities and deserved a second chance to learn. Zendaya was the evening's main guest, scheduled to promote her latest film about overcoming educational barriers. During the pre-show preparation, Zendaya had spent time with Robert in the green room, immediately impressed by his quiet dedication to community service and his innovative approach to adult education. Education should be accessible to everyone, regardless of age or circumstances, Zendaya had told Robert during their backstage conversation. What you're doing represents the best of what education can be, meeting people where they are, using materials that matter to their lives, treating learning as a basic human right. The show began with Zendaya's interview, which covered her film, but also included discussion of educational equity and the importance of literacy for personal empowerment. Zendaya was known for her advocacy for education and social justice, and something about meeting Robert had made her more reflective about the barriers that prevent adults from accessing learning opportunities. Literacy isn't just about reading books, Zendaya told Jimmy during the interview. It's about being able to navigate the world independently, understanding your rights and responsibilities, having access to information that affects your life. When adults can't read, they're vulnerable in ways that most of us never think about. Jimmy nodded, clearly thinking about Robert waiting backstage. Adult literacy is one of those issues that's often invisible because people who struggle with reading learn to hide it. Exactly. And I think the most effective education happens when teachers meet students where they are, using materials and methods that connect to their real lives. Sometimes the most powerful classroom isn't a traditional school building. This comment would prove to be perfectly prophetic, setting the educational foundation for what was about to happen when Robert joined them on stage. Speaking of innovative educators, Jimmy announced as Zendaya's segment wound down, I want to introduce Robert Thompson. Robert has been a mail carrier in Detroit for 30 years, and he has found ways to serve his community that go far beyond delivering mail. Zendaya, I know you wanted to meet him. Absolutely, Zendaya said, her chair being repositioned to make room for Robert. I have tremendous respect for people who dedicate their lives to helping others learn and grow. Robert walked onto the stage with the steady confidence of someone who is accustomed to meeting people from all walks of life with respect and dignity. He wore his best suit, navy blue, the same outfit he wore to community celebrations and church services, and his graying hair was neatly combed. Most notably, he carried a small leather bag that looked like a smaller version of his mail carrier's satchel. Robert, welcome to the show, Jimmy said, helping him get settled in his chair. 30 years as a mail carrier in the same neighborhood. That's incredible dedication to community service. Thank you, Jimmy, Robert replied, his voice carrying the same patient warmth he used when teaching nervous students. I love my route. I love the people I serve. When you walk the same streets and visit the same houses for 30 years, you become part of the community. You get to watch families grow, children graduate, neighborhoods change. It's been an honor. Zendaya leaned forward with genuine interest. Robert, what's the most rewarding part of being a mail carrier? Robert paused, considering how to explain his calling without making it sound more dramatic than it felt to him. The relationships. Mail delivery could be just about dropping off letters and packages, but when you take time to get to know people, when you pay attention to their needs, it becomes about so much more than mail. Jimmy nodded thoughtfully. What do you mean by paying attention to their needs? Well, Robert said, reaching into his leather bag, delivering mail means bringing people information, but not everyone can access that information equally. Some people need help understanding what they receive. The studio grew slightly quieter as the audience began to sense that Robert's work involved more than standard mail delivery. Zendaya's expression grew more interested. Robert, are you talking about helping people who struggle with reading? This was the moment Robert had been both dreading and preparing for. He took a deep breath and decided to be completely honest about the informal education program he had developed over 3 decades. Yes, Robert said simply, I've been teaching people to read on their doorsteps, using their actual mail as learning materials. The studio fell silent immediately. Jimmy's expression changed from curious to amazed. Zendaya sat forward in her chair, clearly intrigued by what Robert was describing. You've been teaching people to read? Jimmy asked. While delivering mail? Robert looked at the 2 younger people who were clearly trying to understand the scope of what he was telling them, then at the audience of strangers who were about to learn about his most meaningful work. For 30 years, Robert confirmed, when someone can't read their own mail, when they're scared of official documents, when they ask me to just tell them what it says, I don't just read it to them once, I teach them how to read it themselves. The impact of this revelation was immediate and profound. Jimmy's eyes widened in amazement. Zendaya's expression showed deep respect and awe. Robert, Zendaya said, her voice filled with emotion, you've been running a literacy program from your mail truck? Not exactly running a program, Robert replied modestly, just helping people learn, one person at a time, using the materials that matter most to their daily lives. Their bills, their medical letters, their legal documents, that's what they need to be able to read. Jimmy was clearly struggling to process the magnitude of what Robert was describing. Robert, how many people have you taught to read over 30 years? Robert reached into his bag and pulled out a worn notebook. I keep track, not officially, but because I want to remember their progress and celebrate their success. In 30 years, I've helped 89 adults learn to read or significantly improve their reading skills. Zendaya stood up suddenly, clearly moved by what she was hearing. Robert, that's extraordinary. You've educated 89 people using their own mail as textbooks. I've helped them educate themselves, Robert corrected gently. All I did was provide patient instruction and treat their learning with dignity. They did the hard work of learning. Jimmy walked around his desk, too moved to remain seated. Robert, can you give us an example of how your teaching works? Robert opened his notebook and found a specific entry. Mrs. Santos was one of my first students. She'd been in this country for 20 years, working as a house cleaner, but she couldn't read English well enough to understand her mail. She was terrified every time she got official letters because she didn't know if they were important or dangerous. The studio was completely quiet, hanging on every word. I started by teaching her to recognize keywords: final notice, urgent, payment due. Then we worked on understanding the structure of bills and official letters. After 2 years of doorstep lessons, she could manage all her correspondence independently. Jimmy felt tears forming in his eyes. What happened to Mrs. Santos? She got her GED at age 57, Robert said with obvious pride. Then she became a certified nursing assistant and worked at Detroit Medical Center for 15 years before retiring, all because she learned to read her own mail. Zendaya was visibly emotional. Robert, you changed the entire trajectory of that woman's life. She changed her own trajectory, Robert replied. I just helped her read the signs along the way. Jimmy addressed the camera directly. Ladies and gentlemen, Robert Thompson has spent 30 years providing free literacy education to adults in his community. He's not a trained teacher. He's a mail carrier who recognized that some people needed help accessing the information he was delivering. The audience responded with sustained emotional applause, but Robert looked uncomfortable with the attention. I want people to understand that literacy barriers affect more adults than most people realize, Robert said, as the applause died down. People are often ashamed to admit they can't read well, so they develop strategies to hide their struggles. But when you can't read, every piece of mail is a mystery that could contain something life-changing. Jimmy felt compelled to explore the personal impact of Robert's work. Robert, teaching 89 people to read over 30 years, that must have required enormous patience and time. Robert was quiet for a moment, considering how to articulate something so fundamental to his sense of purpose. Every person deserves to understand the information that affects their life, he said finally. When someone can't read their own medical instructions, their own bills, their own legal documents, they're vulnerable in ways that education can fix. Taking extra time to help people learn isn't inconvenient, it's essential. But you're not paid to teach, Zendaya pointed out. You're paid to deliver mail. I'm paid to serve my community, Robert replied. Sometimes serving means delivering packages. Sometimes it means delivering knowledge. Both are part of making sure people have what they need. Jimmy made a decision that would become one of the most inspiring moments in Tonight Show history. Robert, do you have any of your teaching materials with you? Robert reached into his bag and pulled out laminated examples of bills, forms, and official documents. I made these copies of common mail types so people can practice without using their actual documents, utility bills, medical statements, government letters. I teach people to recognize the key information in each type. He held up a sample utility bill with important sections highlighted in different colors. Red for amount due, yellow for due date, green for account information. When people learn this system, they can manage their bills independently. As Robert explained his teaching methods, something beautiful happened in the studio. The audience fell completely silent, many people began crying, and even the camera operators found themselves moved by the extraordinary dignity of his approach to education. Robert, Zendaya said through tears, you've been treating education as a basic human service. You've made learning accessible to people who couldn't access traditional education. Everyone deserves to read their own mail, Robert replied simply. Everyone deserves to understand the information that affects their life. That's not a privilege, that's a right. As the segment concluded, something unprecedented happened. The entire studio audience rose not just in applause, but in recognition that they had witnessed something that transcended entertainment. Many audience members were openly weeping, moved by the recognition that one man's commitment to dignity and service had transformed dozens of lives. Robert's appearance on The Tonight Show became one of the most shared segments in the show's history, but not as viral entertainment. Adult literacy organizations shared it as inspiration, educators shared it as an example of innovative teaching, and communities across the country shared it as proof that everyone has something to contribute to education. The impact extended far beyond television. Postal services across the country began training mail carriers to recognize and address literacy needs in their communities. Adult education programs began using Robert's real-world materials approach. Community organizations started doorstep learning programs based on his model, but perhaps the most meaningful response came from Robert's own students and their families, who organized a community celebration to honor his 3 decades of service. Over 200 people attended, including children and grandchildren of people Robert had taught to read, thanking him for giving their families the gift of literacy. Mr. Robert didn't just teach my father to read, said Maria Santos, daughter of Robert's first student. He taught our whole family that learning never stops, that education is for everyone, that one person who cares can change everything. 6 months later, Robert was invited back to The Tonight Show for a follow-up segment. He brought with him a collection of thank you letters written by his former students, letters they could write because he had taught them to read and write. "This is what change looks like," Robert told the audience, holding up the handwritten letters. "When adults learn to read, they don't just gain a skill, they gain independence, dignity, and the ability to help their own children succeed." Robert continues delivering mail in the Riverside neighborhood, still carrying his teaching materials in his bag, still providing doorstep literacy lessons to anyone who wants to learn. His notebook now includes over 100 names of people he has helped become literate, each representing a life transformed by patient, dignified education. Sometimes the most powerful classrooms have no walls, no desks, no formal curriculum, just a dedicated teacher who meets students where they are and uses materials that matter to their real lives. Robert Thompson proved that education is not about buildings or degrees. It's about recognizing that everyone deserves to understand the world around them, and sometimes all it takes is one person willing to teach with patience, respect, and love. Today, the Riverside neighborhood has one of the highest adult literacy rates in Detroit, not because of government programs or institutional initiatives, but because one mail carrier understood that delivering information means making sure people can actually access that information. That's not just good postal service, that's good humanity, delivered one lesson at a time by a man who understood that reading is not a luxury, but a fundamental human right.